Perhaps you've recently become acquainted with VCY's ministry, or perhaps you've been a longtime friend but wonder, how did it all begin? What were the circumstances surrounding the very earliest beginnings of the VCY America broadcast ministry, and what were those milestones along the way? It's our delight to have sharing with us today Mr. Vic Eliason, Vice President and Executive Director of VCY America.
Hi, Jim. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing well. Vic, I'm looking forward to this special recording here to acquaint our listeners with the history behind this ministry.
You're going to be taxing my memory.
We'll do just that. I'd like us to go back to the very beginning, which actually predates radio in 1961. It predates your arrival here in 1959. Vic, as best as your memory can serve, take us back to the very beginning of VCY's ministry.
Well, VCY was previously known in the Milwaukee area, very early years, as Youth for Christ. The Youth for Christ movement across the nation was something that was an evangelistic outreach that was sweeping the country. And there were groups of young people and servicemen that would come together. Actually had its beginnings in the 1940s, late 40s. Wartime here in the Milwaukee area, sailors used to come up on the trains and would be here in the city. They'd come up from Great Lakes. And there were a group of businessmen, T.E. McCulley and others, who had activity going on here then known as Youth for Christ. However, Youth for Christ and its teen ministry and reaching out to kids in high schools really came together about 1954. It was incorporated here in Milwaukee. A gentleman by the name of Russ Johnson came to be the director here, and a group of teenagers had raised some funds. I think it was a total of $500, and they invested this money in support for a YFC director. So in 1954, Russ and a board of directors was formed. Russ presented the program, and incorporation was formed, and it became known as Milwaukee Youth for Christ.
Now, Russ, then, he was here for a period of time, but it wasn't too many years later that you entered into the scene. When was your first interaction with Russ Johnson? How was it that you came to Milwaukee?
Well, actually, my first interaction with Russ Johnson was long before we came to Milwaukee. Russ's father was the sheriff in my hometown, up in Cook, Minnesota. As a little kid, I grew up in the Cook Baptist Church, and of course Adolph Johnson, that was Russ's dad, was the county sheriff. And Russ was a teacher in Daily Vacation Bible School, so I had known him as a DVBS teacher and had been in his guidance then. So many years later, when the opportunity came to be invited to be on the staff here of Milwaukee YFC, I was very much excited about this. And Russ contacted us in Des Moines and mentioned the fact they needed a Bible club director. And so in September of 1959, Frida and I took all of our belongings and cardboard boxes and put them in a U-Haul trailer and headed for Milwaukee.
Mm-hmm. Now, you came here then as a Bible club director. Russ Johnson was still here then as director of the ministry.
That's correct. Russ was the executive director of Milwaukee YFC. It was an organization that I had 20 Bible clubs. When I came here in September, my job was to supervise 20 of them. There were a couple of part-time gentlemen who were with us at that time, Bill and Al Thrall, and they were working in some part-time clubs, or they were part-time directors. There was also Dick Ludwigson, who was a local youth pastor, and he also covered some of the beginning clubs. But I had 20, and if you could imagine going to 20 Bible clubs every week, it was an interesting task.
Now, all of a sudden the day came when you learned that Russ Johnson was going to be leaving the organization.
That was, about a year or so later, 61, kind of late 60, early 61. Russ actually felt led to go back to the very city that we'd come from. We were in Des Moines, Iowa. I had worked with Youth for Christ in Des Moines. He was received a call to go back there and direct Youth for Christ full time. And so when I heard the news, it was kind of a disappointment because I was looking forward to working with Russ. Mm-hmm. And the word was out that in that fall he was going to be leaving.
And the board of directors then at that time?
Well, Russ and the board had approached me and said, would you be willing to be our interim executive director. I was just 23 years of age at the time and just out of Bible college and had served as an associate pastor in Des Moines, and I didn't really know what an executive director did. Russ said he would help me and that they would hire another club director to take my place, and so I said yes. We would be willing to serve as the interim executive director. That meant there was hope that someone else would come in and take the job.
But that hope never came to be.
Well, I was interim for about 3 years, Jim, and after 3 years, everything started. Well, it had been going. There was a lot of excitement going on even when Russ was here. We had exciting things like Clipper trips and Saturday night rallies twice a month, Sunday night Singspirations. It was no lack of activity. I think I was putting on about 1,000 miles a month on my car. We were excited. Kids were living for the Lord, witnessing on campus. But after Russ left, there were other dimensions that began to start to explode as well.
Now, before we get into those dimensions, I know there's a story as well regarding Russ giving you advice as before he left and told you that you could call him when you got into certain kinds of trouble here with the ministry.
I'll never forget the first 2 weeks after Russ left. He had said, now, if you need any help, give me a call in Des Moines. He said, I'll be glad to talk you through some of those things. Well, I got a phone call from the treasurer of Milwaukee Youth for Christ then. There were only 3 of us on the staff. I think the director's salary was $65 a week, and the club director got $55 a week. Our rental on our office was $120 a month, including heat and electricity. And, we were running, I think our total budget was $1,800 a month. And wonderful people. I think about 2,000 people on the mailing list, and a portion of them provided support. Well, after Russ left, the treasurer called me and he said, Vic, we're $1,800 in the red, and we have $5 in the checkbook. What do we do? And I must honestly confess, it was one of those things, well, I'll call Russ. And so I dialed Russ in Des Moines, and I'll never forget, as his cheery voice answered the phone, I said, Russ, you said that if we needed some advice, that we should call you. And I did. And Russ's response when I told him, I said, we're $1,800 in the red, and we have $5 in the checkbook. What do we do? And in his cheery and kind of sparkly way, he said, get used to it, Vic, get used to it. And then he said, no, Vic, what you need to do is fire up the printing press, put out a letter to the investors who supply the funds for VCY and then YFC to continue. And so we did. And I will never forget, as we went down to the old printing press in the basement, which had a spoilage rate of about 20 to 25%. The old thing didn't run really well, but we came out with a letter of appeal. We folded the letter and put it in the envelopes and prepared it for mailing, had it all sorted out, and I called the treasurer. I said we needed $25 for postage. And he, when his very, I don't know how to describe his voice, but it was not excited. He said, well, Vic, you remember, we only have $5 in the checkbook. And so here we were with a mailing ready to go out, only $5 in the checkbook, and we couldn't do anything. There's no way we'd even get the thing out. And so I'll never forget, as Dick Erickson, who was the club director then, and Elaine Olson, who was the secretary, and myself, stood there by that table, and we had a word of prayer. Said, now, Lord, here's a mailing that we can't even mail. It expresses our need to all of our friends. And by the way, we had no radio station then. It was just strictly direct mail. We prayed, said, Lord, if you would have your way in supplying the need, we would be grateful. And we finished that prayer, and I'll never forget, it couldn't have been more than 5 or 10 minutes. The phone rang. And I picked up the phone, and there was the voice of an elderly lady. I'll never forget her name. Her name was Mary Eggert. She lived over in West Dallas. She had been a supporter and a prayer partner for Milwaukee Youth for Christ. And she called and she said, hello, is this Youth for Christ? I said, yes, it is. She said, "Could Youth for Christ use some money today?" My mouth dropped open. I was speechless. And I said, "Well, ma'am, we just got done praying about a financial need." And I said, "Here, you're calling." "Well," she said, "that's wonderful." She said, "I was praying and God impressed on me that you have a need." Now, she said, "I'm too old to bring it down there, but if you'll drive out here to West Dallas, I have," get this, $25 for you. And that was probably one of the most treasured lessons I ever learned in those early years, that God cares about specific needs. We needed $25 to mail that mailing.
And God provided it.
God provided it in one gift, cash gift, from Mary Eggert. And I drove out there. I think my little Nash Rambler was about 6 inches off the ground all the way, carried that money back. The mailing went out, and God provided the need. And I will never forget that as long as I live.
God's continuing miracle, the VCY story. And now, Vic, what was the actual physical location of the ministry at that time?
2631 West State Street. It's just a little bit east of the corner. It's a 4-story brick building, still there. The lower storefront on the west side was our office. It was measuring about 20 by 40. It had a half a basement underneath it where we had our old beat-up printing press, and our office furniture and stuff was all there. We had partitions made of plywood that separated our office. We didn't need an intercom. We just kind of yell over the top. But that was our office, and that was really our do-everything office. We had kids coming in for club meeting, planning, counseling, whatever it was. That was our headquarters.
Vic, now, if you were a Bible club ministry, and this is the interesting part here, how is it that you ever got involved in radio? Because the two are so separate from one another that there's not really a direct link there. What was it that caused you and Milwaukee Youth for Christ at that time to venture into broadcasting?
First of all, in the natural, it would have been insane because I was doing everything from going to clubs, as I mentioned, 20 a week. I worked on the bus, did the janitorial work there around the printing press, and I enjoyed every bit of it. It was a great challenge. But I had no idea thinking about this. Now, as a kid, I will confess that I had an interest in electronics. When I was a teenager, back home in Cook, Minnesota, I made a little transmitter that you could transmit up the country phone line a few miles. And
that was with FCC approval?
No, it wasn't. It didn't have enough power to even warrant FCC approval. But it was, and up in that country where there was only mooses and bears and a few people, you didn't have many listeners anyway. But it was an experiment, and it worked. But I always had an interest in broadcasting, but never even had the wildest idea that we should get involved with it then. But 3 teenagers came up to me and they said, "Vic, could we start a Christian radio program?" And they said one of the kids had a microphone stand, and one of the kids had some LP records, and somebody else had a turntable and a tape recorder, borrowed tape recorder. And so we accumulated all of this stuff and said, well, the first thing we have to do is create a sample program, because we can't just go out there and say we're going to have a radio program. What's going to be on it? What's going to be the format? So we had just rented an apartment, my wife and I, and there was no furniture in it yet except the bed and the kitchen table. And so the front room was all carpet. And so these kids brought this equipment over, and we laid it out on the carpeted floor. And laying on the floor, because we had no chairs in the room, we did our first sample program. And I think it was a 15-minute program, something like that. Had some Christian music on it. And then the object was to take it around to FM stations and ask if they would carry it for free, because we had no money to carry a broadcast. This had to be a public service program or it wouldn't fly at all.
Now, were there religious-based radio stations at that time?
None. There was no Christian stations in Milwaukee, much less FM stations. There were only, at that time, about 3 FM stations. And there was no such thing as stereo in those years. I remember the very first time they did a stereo broadcast in Milwaukee. WTMJ AM carried programming on the AM dial, and then WQFM carried the other channel on the FM station, and you turned on two radios, and it gave you an idea of what you'd call binaural broadcasting, but there was no stereo separation. It was a very feeble effort, but that was Milwaukee in those days.
So there was no Christian radio as we know it.
No.
You prepared this program. You got all excited. You're going to take this now to FM stations.
And we did. We went to the existing FM stations, of which there were about 3. And each of them were very polite. They listened to our tape and then said, well, we can't make up our mind what time of day that kind of music would fit into. And so they respectfully declined our offer for this free program. And to be honest with you, we were kind of discouraged, but we came back with our tape and went to the office and put it up on the shelf and said, well, Lord, if you want us to have a Christian radio program, then you will have to open the door.
That door eventually opened at the office.
5 days later. Unbelievable. 5 days later. We were sitting in our little office there, and as I said, the partitions were open so you could hear people talking.
It's 26th and State.
27th and 2631 West State Street. And I'll never forget, the door opened and a man walked in, and I could hear him say to the secretary, is there anyone here that could use some free airtime? Now, who would come down to 27th and State, a place which is more of a Bowery than it was a Christian site for broadcasting? There were, I think, 10 or 11 taverns in one square block, and
right.
We were having drunkards falling into the doorway of our office more often than not. It certainly was not a place where someone would look to come and give away free airtime. But I dashed out of the door of my little cubicle and got up to the front, and there I met a gentleman by the name of John Harold Clark. He had come from Atlanta, Georgia. He had worked at radio station WAVO down there. He was a Christian. And he had come to Milwaukee and was selling radio time for a little AM station downtown known as WFOX. They had a sales organization. He was out there selling, and that was the way he made his living. And he said that a new FM station had just started out in New Berlin, Wisconsin, known as WBON, and 107.7 on the dial. It was a brand new radio station. And that he was moonlighting out there, and he was doing a music program or two and as a DJ, as well as selling airtime on WFOX. And he opened his heart to me. He said, he said, I've been in Milwaukee. He said, I'm a Christian. But he said, the things I've been involved with have not been honoring to the Lord. And he said, I'm going back to Atlanta. I'm going to be leaving. He says, I want to get back into a good Bible-preaching church and get things squared away with the Lord. But he says, this station where I've been moonlighting, he said, these people, have asked me to do a program on the radio called Sacred Stylings. And he says, in my heart, I don't feel worthy to do this because my life has not been honoring to the Lord. And so I was just driving down the street looking for some Christian organization that might do the job for me, would take the responsibility for the program, because I'm leaving town, he said. And I saw your sign, and I came in. Now, Jim, 5 days earlier, the kids are praying, God, give us some airtime.
Well, Vic, also, 2631 West State is a long ways away from New Berlin.
Yeah, like 8 or 10 miles. And in a town this size, all I can say is that God must have directed John Harold Clark as he drove down those streets to turn that corner onto State Street, see that little plastic sign that says Milwaukee Youth for Christ, and to come in the door and provide an answer to our prayer.
The miracle continues. Vic, what was your reaction when you heard that? What kind of emotion did you face at that time?
I'll tell you, my heart was pounding like crazy. And after I said to him, as he gave me the business card where to go to the station, he said, I said, when do we begin? He says, next Monday. That was like 4 or 5 days from then. And I said, how much time is this? Thinking it was a 1.5 hour program or a 15-minute program a week. Oh, he says, it's a half hour a day and an hour on Sunday. God had already answered far more than our fondest dreams. But what this meant is that we're going to need records. We're going to need programming material. You don't just walk into a studio and suddenly you go on the air with nothing. And so we contacted record companies, and I called Paul Stewart over at the Christian station in Madison, WRVB it was called then. And Paul Stewart sent over some records, and we were gleaning material from everywhere. I had about 4 or 5 LP records, and we started. And God gave us a wonderful beginning. We were very grateful for that.
So you were looking for a quarter hour a week, and the Lord miraculously provided then for a half hour a day.
And an hour on Sunday.
An hour on Sundays.
Now, this is a 38,000 watt radio station, and it covered all over the area. And it was far more than we ever dreamed, but God answered prayer.
What did you call that first program?
We gave it the name that the owners of the station had asked it to be. It was called Sacred Stylings. We still carry that program every day at 5:30. It's called Sacred Stylings, and the very music you hear on that program is the very same music we used as the opening theme.
Now, were these programs that you produced for the station, were they live? Were they pre-recorded yet in your living room? How did that work out?
Well, the very first night, May 15th, 1961, we went out and did the program live. Here was this big, brand new console and microphone, and the studios were hardly even finished. There was still wiring to be done and drawers to be put in the cabinets, and it was a lovely facility. But we knew, because of our busy schedule, it would be impossible for us to keep chasing out to the radio station every night. And so we began immediately to try and put together some recording equipment so that we could put our program on tape and deliver it there. We still have in our glass case out here some of the artifacts of the early beginnings. We took some old World War II parts and components and put together a mixer. We had some early turntables that were, they were 9-inch turntables. We had 12-inch records on them, so you can imagine what that looked like. But it worked. The stuff that we had was very basic. Gradually, we added some better equipment. We did away with those little 9-inch turntables, and we found some better turntables. And gradually, things began to happen that provided us with the ability to record our program, to get it out there on tape.
Now, this was a new venture for the board of directors as well. How did they respond to this new broadcast ministry?
Well, I'll tell you honestly, when we asked them about doing this, they said, well, as long as you do it on your own time, it's okay. And, of course, we were working 15 hours a day anyway, but we tucked it into our spare time if we had any. And the kids were excited. The teenagers were excited and did everything they could to help make this happen.
So the teens were directly involved in the broadcast?
Well, they would come and run the equipment and then would... They didn't host the program, but they were involved in the makings of it and the equipment and the technical things.
And if Grandma had some extra records, I'm sure they brought those down.
Oh,
too.
yeah, you bet. That was the way it was done.
Well, how long did this radio last then, this half-hour day and hour weekends?
We were so excited. We were coasting along just fine, and 8 months later, the station had hired a new program director, and his name was Ron Walker. And Ron said to me one day, he said, Vic, he said, a half-hour religion is too much for any one day. He said, we're going to be terminating your program. We want you to know that. And by the end of the week, our program was off the air.
Both the weekday and the weekend program?
That's right. The whole thing was dropped. It was half-hour religion was too much for any one day. Well, and here, of course, we had a half hour every day and then an hour on Sunday. And so he had some thoughts about how the station should be changed, and that was his prerogative. He was the program director. But we were off the air. And there was a big letdown. I mean, we'd been on for 8 months. We developed a listening audience, and suddenly it was no longer there. And I remember I contracted the flu that weekend, and I was at home in bed, and Frida went to church. And I woke up and turned on the radio, began to turn this little FM radio dial across the spectrum, and wondering if there might be some Christian program that would encourage our hearts. And I stumbled onto a new spot on the dial. It didn't have a Christian program on, but it was a new radio station in Wauwatosa. And there it was at 103.7 WTOS. And as I was listening to this station, I got and I don't know where I came up with the idea. Someone might say it was because you were sick, but the idea came, I wonder if it would be possible to buy some airtime in a block of time, meaning like 8 hours of time a day. Now, where in the world I ever thought we would have the energy or resources to manage that much time in a day, I'm not sure where I don't think I even thought that far. But I picked up the phone, and I found the number of this new station, and I called. And the man who was running it was the owner. Everybody else had the flu bug that week as well. And Mr. Bob Perthel. And I told him that we had been doing a program on another station and that we were no longer on that station. And I told him also about my idea of having a block of time that would be used for all religious programming continually for a period of time. And so I asked him, I said, would you consider selling to YFC 8 hours of time per day, 7 days per week? And then came the cruncher for $500 a month.
My.
And even in those years, I don't think I knew really what I was asking for. But he was so frustrated because he had a limited staff. And he says, he said, I will sell you that $500 a month, 7 days a week, 8 hours a day, from 4 to midnight, if you will provide the manpower to run the station, meaning volunteers. Mm-hmm. And when he said that, I began to feel better. He said, could you come over and talk with me this afternoon? It was a Sunday afternoon. And I drove over to this little station. It was in the basement of a gasoline station. The tower was bolted to the side of the building. It stood about 100 feet in the air. The station only had 3,000 watts of power. And the transmitter was an old antique thing that had been restructured and put together. And I met with Bob Perthel, and we talked it through. And I said, before I can make any commitments, I need to talk to our board of directors. I said, the concept would be to pay $500 a month, and you'd give us 8 hours of broadcasting 7 days a week, 8 hours a day. 8 hours a day. He said, I'll tell you what, I know you've got a board of directors to talk to. So he said, I will give you the radio station for the next 2 weeks. For the next 2 weeks, free of charge, to run as you would. And you start at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you go to midnight for the next 2 weeks. And you use that as a living example. And he says, if your board of directors approves and you got the support raised, then we sign a contract. But he says, if nothing happens, if nobody is interested, then you've had 2 weeks of free broadcasting. He says, you can't lose. I said, well, I think we can agree on that. And so that's exactly what happened. I got on the phone. I called Paul Stewart again over in Madison. I said, Paul, we're going on the air. We're going to be on 8 hours a day, 7 days a week for the next 2 weeks, and send me some programming. He sent me tapes of Back to the Bible and Walter Wilson and Heaven and Home Hour, and all the old-time broadcasts were there, and all kinds of LP records, more than we had ever had. and send it over on the Badger bus. I picked it up at the bus, and the box was so heavy I could almost hardly not carry the thing. The bottom almost fell out of the box. We got it into the car, and we began to make plans. And we didn't have enough tape programs to run a series every day. So then this may be laughable, but Monday night was Back to the Bible night. And so we'd play some songs, maybe for an hour. Then we'd play the Back to the Bible half hour. Then we'd go for another hour or two with music, and then we'd go back and play the same Back to the Bible again. That was Back to the Bible night. The next night was Walter Wilson night, and the next night was somebody else's night, because we did not have enough material to do this. But people started listening, and they loved it. And within 2 weeks, not only was the board impressed, but a number of churches stepped forward and said, look, if you'll give us a half hour of time, we'll give you $15 a week. And that's how things started. And we were able to bring together enough funding to pay that $500 a month. And Bob Berthel was happy, we were happy, and started programming. We had volunteers that would come into the studio at night. I remember some men who were mechanics, some were architects, some were whatever. They'd come and donate a night of service and sit there and run the transmitter. Well, that was when we began to develop our little studio down at 2631 West State Street. We scraped enough money together to put in a telephone line to carry our signal from State Street out to New Berlin, or rather to Wauwatosa, where WTOS was. And in installing that phone line, we were able to have our own little tiny studio down there at the offices. And that's where the young people then got involved in running the equipment.
Well, the miracle continues. But Vic, all of a sudden one day, there was notice given to you in some form that was going to terminate your relationship here at WTOS.
It actually was more of an offer to continue if we would raise our funds. And I don't fault Mr. Berthel for that at all, because the amount we were paying was certainly very reasonable. But he said for 8 hours a day, he said, I really should be getting more money. And he asked us for $1,400 a month if we were going to continue.
Up from the $500.
Up, yeah. In other words, it would be 14 instead of 5. And we began to weigh our options and look around, and we felt that if we were going to pay that extra money, we would hope to have a little more power for outreach to expand our audience. And the station at that time was only 3,000 watts and 100 feet off the ground. Well, in so doing, we became acquainted with a station known as WMIL FM. Its studios now were located at 26th and Wisconsin, just about 4 blocks from our offices. I went to see the owners, Mr. Saul Radoff and Mr. Gene Posner, who owned WMIL. And they were Jewish men. They knew exactly what our message was. And I explained what we wanted to do. They said, well, if you're not anti-Semitic, we'll be glad to have you on the air. And I said to both of them, I said, I want you to know that the best friend I have in the whole universe is Jewish.
Amen.
His name is Jesus. And they had no problem. And they said, well, we'll go along with you. We'll sign a contract for a year. And we did. And so for $1,400 a month, we now had 25,000 watts of power and CBS News at the top of the hour anytime we wanted it. And so our little studio over on 2631 West State Street was now connected to a 25,000 watt station.
Now, was that for the same block of time?
Same block of time, from 4 o'clock to midnight. What happened, however, was that after we had been on almost a year, some of the unions became, well, these were all union employees except for our kids. And the kids are doing the work, and the union employees over at the studios were sweeping the floor and polishing the windows because they had nothing to do. Our kids were doing this from our studios. And so Mr. Posner called me, and he said, Vic, he said, when we're just about a month away from renewing the contract, he said, we'll be glad to sign another contract with you. But the unions have said you cannot continue to run the console and the programming. The union men will have to handle this, and they can answer the phone here at the studios, but you just bring the stuff over in a box. And I said, Gene, I don't feel that this is what God would have us to do. Well, why not? He says, where else would you go? And I said, Gene, we can't renew the contract. He wanted to know if we had any other place to go. I said, no, I don't. But if the young people are not involved in handling the programming, if we do not have the opportunity to interface with our listeners and to counsel them from the Word of God or whatever, it just can't be. And I'll never forget, we knew the contract was coming down the home stretch here, and we had about a month left. Then it was 3 weeks left. Then it was 2 weeks left. We had nowhere to go, and the young people in the studios were running the station. They didn't even know that our contract was coming to an end, and I was scared to tell them. It came down to 1 week, and still no answer. Nobody on planet Earth knew, except us. We were praying, oh God, guide, supply, direct, whatever it is. We were down to 3 days before the program would go off the air, and I got a phone call from Mr. John Derringer, who is one of the owners of WBON out in New Berlin, the very first station we were on. And Ron was no longer the program director, and there was a change of sentiment. And he had called, and he said, how are things going, Vic? I said, well, it's interesting that you would call. Now, bear in mind, there's only 3 days left. John did not know anything about our contract running out. He said, how are things going? Well, I said, well, it's interesting that you should call. I said, because we've got 3 days left on our contract and have nowhere to go. He said, well, that's why I'm calling. He said, I was wondering if you might be interested in coming back on our station. He said, we really don't have that much interest in the main channel. We're using the sub-channel to broadcast background music to restaurants. And he said, the main channel, if you would be willing to come back, we would hire you for $1 a year as our program director. And he said, you can control the programming any way you like, and you can broadcast 19 hours a day, 7 days a week. We started contacting a number of the other national broadcasts. We had 3 days left to make the change. I called the telephone company, and they worked miracles in hooking up phone lines to New Berlin. And that evening when we went off WMIL, we were able to say, this will be our last broadcast on WMIL. Tune us in tomorrow morning at 107.7 on the FM dial. And God opened a special blessing that day. That was 1964 when we made that change. God answered prayer in the 11th hour. Nobody on planet Earth knew about our need but the Lord, and God opened that door.
And Vic, this is why through the history of this ministry that God receives the glory, because man in ourselves cannot maneuver to make things happen. It is only through God that this miracle continues.
And it is a continuing miracle. It's the kind of thing that, there's no way in the world. We did not have the expertise to do this. We had no background in negotiating with unions. We had no background in even much of anything, except God opened that door of opportunity. And it was obvious we should step through it.
Well, as you're back now on WBON, you're broadcasting 19 hours a day. That must have been, 5 in the morning till midnight at that time?
Yes, it was, I think it was 5 or 6 in the morning, something like that.
And this station yet was not owned by this ministry. There was an outside group of owners for it. Did the board of directors come with you here through each one of these steps?
By the way, after we started that 8-hour block, they knew by this time that this is obviously becoming a part of the ministry and had full blessing behind what we were doing. In fact, we were all elated to see what God was doing. By the way, still having Bible clubs and rallies and things of this nature, so we still had a full plate. We did cut our rallies back to once a month, though, and Singspiration's schedule was modified somewhat. But we continued from 1964 until 1968, when Mr. Derringer called me. He said, Vic, we are considering selling WBON. And in that you people have been buying a block of time every day on the air. We would like to give you the first option to buy the station if you're interested. And he said the price will be $318,000. There was kind of a loud gulp as we heard this. And in today's economy, of course, that would be a bargain for a station. But at that time in the city of Milwaukee, it was one of the higher prices that was ever paid for the sale of an FM radio station. And we talked it over among the board of directors, and they said we have no other option but to negotiate and to pray and ask God to raise the funds. And Mr. Deringer said if we can raise $75,000 for a down payment, that they would even carry us for a while. Well, we brought this need to the general public, and the people began to give. And long story short, the $75,000, $78,000 was raised to make it possible. We began making payments, and ultimately the Lord made it possible that in 1970 we consummated the sale for the station for $315,000. It took about 2 years to raise those funds, and we're so grateful. In 1970, WBON was the official voice of Milwaukee Youth for Christ.
Vic, let's digress just one moment and talk about FM for a moment. How prevalent was FM when you began broadcasting? You started in 1961. Mm-hmm. Were FM radios available? Were people able to tune in and listen?
Well, in 1961, FM was really not that well known. In fact, most people said, "Oh, that kind of radio, we don't have that." FM radio, when you'd listen to it, it had a very clear sound. It wasn't stereo. It was monophonic radio, but it had a clear sound. But the radios themselves had a strange characteristic. You'd put them on frequency, and in about 10 minutes, they would drift off frequency, and you'd have to quick go back and tune them back in. That was the normal way FM worked. And then they came out with a high-tech thing called AFC, which is automatic frequency control, a little button that you'd push on the new radios, and they would stay on frequency. Wow, that was a great achievement. But there was still no stereo. And our audience was so limited, we found a company called Sarks Tarzian. They made FM radios, plastic FM radios, and for somewhere in the $20 to $15, I think it was, for an FM receiver, and about $22 for an FM AM receiver. So we bought them by the case and sold them just for what we paid for them, just to increase our listening audience. And it worked. People started listening.
Vic, the time came then when there was a decision made to change the call letters of the station.
Well, we operated from 1970 to 73. And June 1st, 1973, was a very special day because VCY, or Milwaukee Youth for Christ, had decided to change our name that would be more in line with the broadcast ministry as well as what we were doing. Still working with young people, but the broadcast ministry was becoming very dominant at that point. And so June 1st, 1973, the call letters of the station were changed to WVCY, and the organization name was called Wisconsin Voice of Christian Youth. And so we continued doing what we were doing, but there was a new name change.
And then there was another milestone that came into its to the listening ability of radio, as well as far as the quality of the sound.
A couple of years later, 1975, other stations by now had heard about and were actually innovative in going stereo. I remember a station called WMKE, run by Mr. Dick Steffen here in the city. It was one of the first stations to go stereo. And you had to buy this little special gadget box that sat on the outside of your radio and would run another amplifier and then would give you what was then known as stereo. Well, that was in the early 70s. By 1975, other stations were stereo. We weren't. Also, one of the things that we weren't was what we call circular polarized. Our antenna would send out the signal in a horizontal direction, but the vertical direction, which would be picked up by cars, was not part of that picture. And so we proposed the purchase of a new transmitter, a new antenna that would reach more effectively to automobiles and at the same time would allow us to go stereo. And we had a fundraising project to do this. I remember it was about $100 and some thousand to buy the transmitter and, in fact, some automation equipment, too, that would make it more flexible for us because we had a very small staff. And I remember we had a fundraiser where we went to the Mark Plaza. This was the evening when we switched to stereo. We went to the Mark Plaza Hotel, which is now known as the Hilton Hotel here in Milwaukee. They had the big crystal ballroom that we had rented it for a special banquet. And we had Russ Kilman come in and a number of other folk. I remember...
Russ was with the Heaven and Home
Heaven
Hour.
and Home Hour, right. And he came in. We had a number of pastors came in as just giving a vignette, a small message. I remember we had some distinguished guests that were there. John Koss from Koss Headphone Company was there, and a lot of other folk that were there to watch this happen. We hooked up stereo speakers all across the front of this ballroom, and we're actually broadcasting from the ballroom in mono, the way we had always done. And we had projected it straight up 10 o'clock. It was a late banquet, let me tell you. At 10 o'clock, we would cut the switch over and we would become stereo. And I will never forget, as the audience waited for that moment, and it took about 60 seconds to make the switch, we came to the end of the mono broadcasting, and the very first sound that came out of those speakers was a beautiful song, Eternal Father of Mankind. It was in stereo, Montevani's orchestra. And it just filled the ballroom. And I saw people standing with tears running down their faces, and it was kind of a moving event at that point because WVCY was now stereo, and it was now full power. They cut to the new antenna, and we had more power than we'd ever had before, and it was a real milestone.
Now, were the Bible Club ministries and rally ministries continuing during this time?
Yes, they were. We were, of course, running from 1963 on. We'd had difficulties because Madeline Murray O'Hare had raised a big ruckus about her son. And interestingly enough, of course, he later became a Christian. But prayer and Bible reading was removed from the school. Anybody that even hinted anything spiritual. Our clubs had been relegated totally outside the school. We were asked to not meet in the school building. We were meeting in buses or homes. And then they started, in these later years, they started mandatory busing, which kids, even after school, couldn't even stay there because they had to ride the bus back to where they were. And it caused a great deal of difficulty in maintaining the club program as we had once known it.
I'd like us also just to, before we look at some new outreach and expanded outreach that began with radio, just to spend a moment or two looking at some of those initial staff people, some of the early staff. Were they paid staff? Were these volunteers that ran the ministry? Who are some of those that come to mind and some of those things that stick out in your mind?
Well, way back in the beginning, of course, it was when we were doing this broadcast, it was all volunteer. But then when we went 8 hours a day, we had to have somebody to run this thing. And, of course, every evening you went on the air at 4 o'clock. Well, there was a young man who walked up from Boys Tech. His name was Al Knuth. And he walked up from Boys Tech all the way to 27th and State to volunteer his time to run the radio station. And so he worked like a beaver. He was a ham operator, and he rejoiced in being a part of this. Well, later, of course, when we went to the 8 hours of time and a more demanding program, I mean, Al couldn't maintain all of this 56 hours a week on his own. He would just come up and cover the evening, and some of us would work shifts or do something to fill in the time. A young man named Larry Trumbauer was in Chicago. He was a Milwaukee boy. He had always had an interest in Christian radio, and radio specifically. He was driving city bus, and he heard about this project. And he called me up one day, and he said, "Vic," he said, if you'll have me, he said, "I'll quit my bus driving job here in Chicago and come up and run that station for you." he became our first full-time employee.
My.
Today, he's on the mission field running a radio station in Puerto Rico.
I know the early staff and volunteers were very, very dedicated. One even having an appendicitis attack while he was running the station.
Forageable, I'll never forget that. Out at the transmitter site, of course, for every hour we were on the air from our studio, you had to have a real live person out there at the transmitter. And one night, one man would come in, the next night, someone else. Well, one of the dear friends of our ministry, Forageable, was out at the transmitter one evening, and he was not feeling well. Obviously, he had an appendicitis attack brewing, but he was not going to leave. He was going to stay there until the end of his shift. And in that period of that time, his appendix did burst, and he was going to stay there regardless. And in pain, finally got into his car and drove home. And his commitment was greatly admired. He didn't realize what was happening. But God wonderfully spared his life. He was involved in so many areas. He would run the station. He would do remote broadcasts. He would sort our tapes. All of this while being a mail processor at the U.S. Post Office.
You're listening to God's Continuing Miracle, the VCY story. We learned of the purchase of WBON in 1970, the call letters being changed in 1973 to WVCY. But Vic, it was in 1976 that you had a special visit to the Federal Communications Commission.
I sure did. For some reason, we had thought about expanding. As God was blessing, we began to see the impact of Christian radio on the families of this city. And I was in Washington, D.C., talked to a man named Dick Dean, and heard about the fact that the FCC had some frequencies available for television. And I went over to the FCC, and I talked with the gentleman there. His name was Quentin Proctor. And Quentin was one of the movers and shakers in the commission. And I said, Mr. Proctor, can you tell me if there are any frequencies available for TV yet in Milwaukee? And so he went over to a little 3x5 card box, and he pulled up Milwaukee. And there he said, well, yes, there are several frequencies. He said, there's channel 58, there's channel 30, and he named several channels that were available. And he says, I'll tell you what, he said, we're granting applications to build stations, and you can build a station fairly reasonable with used equipment. He said, here's a guy named Dick Dean, and he hands me Dick Dean's application of what they had done in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And he said, if you want to take a copy of this, you can go back to your home and see if you can't put something like that together. Well, we did. And that's where the concept for Channel 30 came about. All of the staff, with the help of Mr. John Lafferty, an electronics engineer, and Gordy Morris, and a number of other staff people, we put together our application. And then there was kind of a complicated thing developed. In those years, they had a problem called duopoly ownership, meaning that if you had a radio station, they didn't know if they wanted you to have a television station too. Of course, Milwaukee Journal had all three, but in this particular case, they were having a second look at it. And so it took several years of investigation by the FCC, and one day we got the construction permit. And they said, we hereby authorize you to build Channel 30. We applied in 1977 for the construction permit. It was 1982, actually, when they granted it to us.
Now, Vic, you had never run television before.
No, sir.
How did you respond when you had that piece of paper come in the mail authorizing construction?
Well, I'll never forget, as John Lafferty was here at our office when it came in, and I said, John, we've got this construction permit. What do we do now? And he looked up at me and he says, gulp. He says, it's kind of like if somebody gives you a baby elephant, what do you do with it?
But Vic, you began construction.
Well, we had to, and this was a miracle as well. First we had to find a transmitter. Then we had to find a place where we could put our antenna. And the transmitter had to be purchased. Transmission line. We could probably go for 3 hours just talking about the miracles that happened there. I'll never forget a couple if I have time to share that.
Sure, please
Jim.
do.
We did find a transmitter. It was Channel 36, and their transmitter was adaptable to Channel 30. And so we purchased that transmitter at a greatly reduced price. we needed transmission line, and we heard about a station down in Knoxville, Tennessee that was taking down their line, and for a fraction of the cost of new line, we purchased used line. That line is still working like new today, many years later. 19 years later, it's still fine. But when we purchased this transmitter, and we began to raise funds, of course, and people started to give toward the project, we knew that in the natural, it would cost probably $1 million or $2 million to build this thing. But we prayed, we saw God provide equipment that was the hand-me-downs from other stations, lighting, old cameras, tripods, studio distribution amplifiers, things that we could use, and the stations all over town were giving us things that they knew that they didn't need anymore. We acquired much of this equipment, plus buying the new stuff that was needed to put it together. And I'll never forget, as the time came to move that transmitter from up at Channel 10 and 36's building to the place we had found, and to hook it up to the tower that we were renting now. And I will never forget, as I was kind of frustrated that day at the office, Lord, what are we going to do? The phone rings, and a man by the name of Nolan Tobias calls me, and he said, is this Mr. Eliason? I said, yes. I understand you've purchased a TV transmitter. Now, folks, if I can break thought for a moment, a TV transmitter is like 7 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and the transmitter stands about 35 feet long. It weighs tons. The tubes are so big you have to use a chain hoist to get them out of the transmitter. The tubes are $28,000 a piece. There's miles of wiring, 20,000-volt transformers, all of this. Yours truly did not know beans about this. And we had no one here that could handle it. Nolan's on the phone, and he says, I understand you purchased this transmitter. Do you have someone to disassemble it and to move it from where it is now to your new location? And I said, Mr. Tobias, no, we don't have someone. He said, would you like to have someone volunteer their services? And I almost dropped my teeth. He said, I am an electronics engineer that would be qualified to do that. But he said, there's one requirement, is that I do it for no charge. He said, my work will be a gift. And he says, if it'll make you feel any better about this, he says, I'm the engineer that used to run that transmitter for the last 9 years.
Praise the Lord.
Nolan Tobias and his father-in-law moved that transmitter, hooked it up in the new location, and it worked just fine. Well, the same thing happened down at the studios. We had a whole master control room to build down there. That's a different location. And we didn't know beans about hooking this stuff up. And I had another phone call, very similar, almost the same words. A gentleman called from Midland Video Productions, and he said, I understand that you people are putting a TV station together. And he said, do you need any help putting your control room together? I'm a control room engineer. I said, yes, we do. He says, how much help do you need? I says, like the whole thing? He says, I'll be down. But he says, I don't want any money for it. This is my gift to see this station start. And he came down and installed and timed and put into service the control room that we use today.
January 11th, 1983 came on the calendar. The very first broadcast on WVCY Channel 30. What do you recall about that first broadcast, signing on the air?
Well, I remember just a few days earlier, which was Christmas, we had hoped to have the station on the air on Christmas night. In fact, we'd already told the newspaper that a new star would be shining over Milwaukee on Christmas night. And the only problem was that the best laid plans of mice and men don't always work out, because we contracted the worst ice storm you have ever seen, and the crew that was in here from Cincinnati, Ohio, refused to climb that big 1,000-foot tower because it was covered with ice. And so we had to shut down our plans. We never got on the air in December, and everybody went home for the holidays. They got back, and it was January, well, it was just before January 11th. We got everything done. I remember that day we'd all been up at the transmitter soldering copper together and all the other things, and our hands were covered with solder paste. Everybody chipped in to do something. And we hurried, cleaned up, dashed down to the studios, and we were going on the air that night at 6 o'clock, I believe it was. And we went on the air with no announcements. Nobody in town knew about it. But everybody was waiting for it to happen. And I remember we went on the air and invited people to call in. By faith, we'd already hooked up the phone lines. We had 14 phone lines. And the phones began to ring, and I don't remember how many hundred phone calls came in, but hundreds of calls came in, people that were watching Channel 30. And January 11th, 1983, 6 p.m., Channel 30 was born.
And the miracle continued.
And it continues.
Now, during that time as well, prior to TV 30 signing on, there was a location change. You did move your offices from State Street.
That's true. We during 1968, we purchased an old bank building at 27th and Valete Street. This is about 3 blocks, I think it was, north of where we had been on State Street. And we had purchased this building for $20,000 and had remodeled it and had turned it into an office building. And we had moved into that office building in 1970. And so when we turned stereo, when we had grown with the new facilities, we were operating from a building that was our very own. So that meeting room that we had up on second floor, which housed about 400 people, that room suddenly had to be converted into a television studio.
That was another miracle in itself as well, that transition process. Vic, the board of directors during this time were also looking at ways for continued outreach. The Bible Club ministries were going on, Bible correspondence courses, rally ministries, ministry to delinquent youth, on and on the ministries went. Mm-hmm. But the board was not content to stay put and just to leave things as they were. They had a vision to reach beyond Milwaukee, to reach beyond southeast Wisconsin in a way to capture new listeners here within the state.
Well, yes, and along with some of this, and so many things were a part of this mosaic, in 1978 we had started a Christian school. Mm-hmm. And 1978, we had moved, actually, we had only been in, our offices had only been in our building on Valete Street for 8 years, and then our offices moved to 35th and Kilbourne, where a new Christian school was being born. And so there were so many growth, everything started exploding in a way. The staff was larger. We had then grown to 12 or 14 and more staff. Then God had opened the door for the acquisition of another radio station up in Tomah, Wisconsin. And in order for us to get the signals there, we either had to maintain a staff up in Tomah and then a staff down here. And, of course, a double staff meant double overhead, the cost, and all those things. And so I remember we had hired a guy named Jim Schneider from Kansas City. You came up and actually took over the managership of WVCX in Tomah. But our prayer was that somehow we could use satellite to link the stations together so there'd be a consistency in programming.
Let's talk about WVCX for just a moment. Former call letters of the station were WTMB.
That's right.
Broadcasting in Tomah, Wisconsin. A very unique location. It was a crossroads of the state where the interstates divide and many state highways going to that location. This was a new venture in that it was a few hours from the home base here in Milwaukee as well. The people in this area of WVCX were many people who had no access to Christian radio before. Tell us about the excitement that was breeded during that time. And I know that there was a changeover that occurred. And I know Robbie Heiner, his song was the very first song played on the station.
Well, the man who had owned WVCX was an attorney. In fact, his father was an attorney too. The Dickey family, and Hugh Dickey had died. Let's see, was it Hugh? Hugh Dickey was the owner of the station. And then Dean Dickey, his son, had pretty much determined he didn't want to go on in radio broadcasting. He was a very busy and prosperous attorney. And so the station was put up on the auction block to purchase it. And so we negotiated for and purchased the station. The FCC took a while to approve the purchase, and finally the day came when the big cutover occurred. Now, WTMB at that point had been a pretty much country-type multi-service programming facility. They had everything from the local daily auction to the weather reports and maybe some farm reports, agricultural things, cultural things within the city. It was a powerful station. It had its antenna up on the bluffs outside of Tomah. But one minute it would be one style of music, one another. It was all secular. Well, on the day we were to take over, they had pretty much determined they wanted to run the station up till noon. And at noon, we would switch over. Much of the equipment they had there in Tomah was so defective and tired and old that you almost had to bump it and slam it in order to keep it working. And so we didn't want to have any more glitches happen than might happen with that old equipment. So we brought in some temporary equipment and put it down the hall from the master control room. And we had laid a plan that would take about 60 seconds to switch from their equipment to ours. And so that was to happen right at 12 up noon. So I'll never forget, they came to the end of the program at that noon, and they played Happy Trails to You Until We Meet Again. And they said, "This is WTMB signing off." There was 60 seconds of waiting as we looked down the hall and watching for Gary's thumbs up that he had the wires hooked up. He gave us a signal, and we came on with the new call letters. This is WVCX, Tomah, a new radio voice with a new purpose. And the first song we played was Robbie Heiner on the air, and he sang the song, "I'll praise your name, Lord, I'll sing your song." And that was the turn of events. We understand there were kids down the road in Sparta had brought their boom boxes to school that day and were listening, and when the switchover came, there was a big cheer occurred in the school. But there was a cheer in the hearts of lots of people because they'd been praying for a Christian radio voice.
So there were two Christian radio ministries. There was a Christian television station. I recall some of those early days at WVCX as well, in which some of the first simulcasting occurred. Mm-hmm. Your TV program In Focus, Comrex lines were utilized to phone in so people could hear the issues that were occurring, and all that was simulcast. And that was a very early, perhaps the early hints of wanting to bring the stations together for satellite communications, which you were talking about. And it was March 26, 1987. You had a special share-a-thon that you hosted. We called it an Uplink Share-a-thon.
That's right. And there had been a lot of disturbance on the national scene. Jim Baker had just been announced, the heartbreaking things that had gone on with PTL. And the world was watching, and here we were on the air trying to raise funds for a $65,000 uplink. And I remember that day as we shared the need with people, and the purpose was to tie together the stations so they could have consistent programming, and it would literally give us a pipeline that could be run for other stations as well. And I'll never forget as the newspapers contacted us and said, "Well, how is your fundraising going?" Thinking that we'd have a dour story for them because of the sad things that had gone on in the national picture. And what a thrill it was to come to the end of that day, and I believe we had reached the goal in one day.
The stated goal was $65,000 for the uplink transmitter and facilities. And as TV30 was joined that evening at 7 o'clock to bring the TV audience during that hour between 7 and 8, that $65,000 plus dollars came in to provide for that uplink. Now, as this was also being planned, as the uplink was being planned, it was not just to serve WVCX. There were also plans underway at that time for a station in South Dakota that actually came about, I believe, through a WVCX listener.
That's right. There was a lady who was listening to WVCX in Tomah who had a brother who was out in Gregory, South Dakota. He was in his senior years. He was thinking of selling his 100,000-watt radio station, KKSD, in Gregory, South Dakota. And so we became aware that this station might be for sale and had gone out to visit this station and looked it over. And after seeing it and looking at the purchase price that the man was asking, we did not feel that we were prepared financially to go ahead with this offer. Came back home, put the file back in the file cabinet, and about 6 weeks later, I think it was, somewhere near that, I may be off on that time, Jim, but we received a phone call from a group of businessmen who were praying for Christian radio, praying that God would provide Christian radio to South Dakota. And what the interesting thing was that they were praying, we had been praying, asking God to guide us. They asked us if we would not reconsider, and coming back, they found out that the station could be purchased for less. Then they said, we will raise the first $65,000 as a down payment if you will take the responsibility to foster and bring to life a Christian radio ministry. And then they said, we'll support, we'll pray, we'll get the people giving. Well, that happened, and today, of course, we have WVCX, 100,000 watts, I should say, in Toma. Then we have KVCX in Gregory, South Dakota.
Signed on the air April 17th of 1987.
That's right.
And also in the work at that time was a ministry to its south in Fort Scott, Kansas, a ministry that was struggling, known as KFTS.
We had gone down to Missouri. My wife is a native of Missouri, Sheldon, Missouri, and which is not too far from Fort Scott, Kansas. Well, every time we would go down there, we would listen to this little Christian radio station that was on the air. And this time we went down and found out you could hardly hear it. My son, who's our chief engineer, he said, Dad, I think they must be having trouble because we can hardly hear the station. Let's go over and see if we can help them. And so we drove over to KVCY, or it was then known as KFTS, and found that here was this little station that was so damaged that the transmitter was running on 6% of its normal power. 6%. It was 94% inefficient. And it was broadcasting this limited signal. Here were volunteers that were giving of their time, and the station literally was in receivership. The bank was ready to foreclose. The funding was there was nothing sufficient to meet the needs. And we had a chance to meet Will Russell and Gracie Cobbler and some of the other people that were there then running the station. And they said, we need some help. We sat down, visited with Will Russell, and in a very interesting chain of events, God made it possible for us to negotiate with the receiving bank that was ready to close them down. The president of the bank said, look, if you people will come in and keep this a Christian station, I'll forgive all the back interest. I'll forgive everything if you can just pick up the note where it is. And if you would come in here and take over and put this station back on its feet. Well, today the station is not even a 3,000 watt station. It's not a 6,000 watt station. It's putting out, well, it has 25,000 watts of ERP, but that at that height is closer to the effect of 50,000 watts. It's reaching clear down to the outskirts of Joplin, Lamar, Missouri, clear up to Harrisonville. And we thank God for what he has done. And Gracie Cobbler and Will Russell are still working for the station.
Now, each of these stations that we mentioned have a whole series of miracles in themselves.
Every one of them.
Time does not allow for us to go into at this point. But station after station is a continued sign of God's continuing miracle here through VCY. It was in 1991 that the actual uplink, national uplink, began to service stations all over the country. It was just after KVCY and KVCX came on that we were able to do the simulcast. The satellite communications began, national program distribution began, and then that takes us up to the 1990s when there was a station that you became aware of in Oshkosh, Wisconsin.
Yes, there was a station known as WXOL. It had been owned and operated by a gentleman that had been an alcoholic. He'd been struggling in this area of his life and in a situation that was desperate. The station was in receivership. The bank was ready to shut it down. And what was a thrilling thing that we heard, first of all, is that the man who had been running the station, and though he had had his disaster, had come to Christ and had found the Lord. And so we had the opportunity of acquiring WXOL, newly then known as WVCY AM 690. And brother in Christ, Steve Rose, who had been the manager of that station, and before he knew the Lord, had been in desperate straits. Now here's a man that's been redeemed, and we hired the man who used to own the station to be our operator, and Steve was there for a number of years, faithfully operating the station, and what a blessing it was. And today, of course, WVCY AM 690, Bob Gardenier is our operations manager there, and the signal goes forth.
Now, at the same time, while this acquisition was going on, you had also been receiving a petition from many, many people in the Eau Claire, Chippewa Falls area saying,
500 people.
Bring Christian radio to our community as well.
500 people signed petitions and said, we would like to have a station in this area that is rich in Bible teaching, that takes its prime time and uses it for the teaching and edification and the ministry of Bible preaching. And so we responded. We actually were able to take one of the transmitters from one of the other stations, refurbish it, one of the towers from another station, as the station down in Kansas went to the newer tower. We took that tower up here, and so that tower had a second life. That transmitter had a second life. And so today you can listen up there in Eau Claire to the station that is reaching out. That's 90.5 WVCF radio. It continues to minister daily.
So, folks, March 14th, 1995, WVCY AM came on the air. March 26th of 97, WVCF Eau Claire came on the air. Again, that story is a miracle in itself. For a long time, it looked like just through competitions with others seeking that frequency, it did not look like it would be possible. But God enabled for WVCF to come on the air. And also in 1997, Vic, there was another station added in Salina, Kansas, August 1st.
Salina, Kansas, Mr. Galen Gott, who was the operator of a non-commercial station in Salina, Kansas, indicated that he wanted to sell and that he was going to be going into another type of broadcasting, and approached us. We, as the board of directors, evaluated. It was concluded that KCVS radio would be something that should be added to the VCY family of stations as it was growing. And so it was not a high-powered station. It was operating at 1,000 watts of power. But it covered Salina quite well. And so it was acquired August 1st, 1997, continuing now with all of the ministry of programming that comes through the VCY America network 24 hours a day. But then the opportunity came to increase its power. Our prayer has always been, Lord, help us to strengthen that outreach and to reach out to more people. And in December 12th of 2000, the power increase occurred in Salina. And we're so grateful that what we've seen happen is just an absolute miracle there. The tower, instead of the tower where we had been broadcasting, we located a new spot 300 feet higher, and instead of a 300-foot tower, we put up a 495-foot tower, increased the power, and now at this point, I believe we're putting out what would be the equivalent of somewhere near 50,000 watts effective rated power. The signal reaches almost to the outskirts of Wichita, Kansas, clear up to Fort Riley. We see reports coming in from all around Salina, and we're grateful.
We have also seen here in the late 90s a series of translators that have joined the VCY family as well.
A translator or satellator is a low-power transmitter. Runs by itself, has to have a satellite dish, picks up the signal from outer space there, and rebroadcasts our signal to a community. It may cover up to 30 miles, depending on the height of the antenna. But our first translator there was Mitchell, South Dakota. That was September 5th, 1997. December 1st of 1997, we saw the construction completed on a translator in Ironwood, Michigan. And that ministry has been serving the Lord ever since. We moved to May 21st, 1998, and construction was completed on a translator, a satellator we call them, in Monroe, Wisconsin. And that has been ministering there since May 21st, 1998. And of course, in November of 1998, that was November 7th, construction was completed on a translator serving the Charleston, Mattoon, Illinois area. This was an area the folk had asked for Christian radio. They said they would support this if it would come to their community. And ever since that date, the ministry has been 24 hours a day, touching lives there in Illinois.
Now, Vic, as this ministry has sought to go beyond its borders of the city of Milwaukee, go beyond the borders of the state of Wisconsin, there was another name change that occurred through the 90s as well, from Wisconsin Voice of Christian Youth Incorporated to VCY America Incorporated.
And the reason was basically because VCY was becoming known outside of Wisconsin, and we were no longer limited to the state of Wisconsin. And so VCY America was chosen as God is opening doors all over America for people to listen.
Yet another station was added September 24th of 1999.
We became aware of a station that had never broadcast before. It hadn't been on the air. It had just been newly constructed by a man up in Beriga, Michigan, Mr. Dave Savolainen. Good Swedish name. I chuckle. That's a Finnish name, really. But Dave and I had some conversation about the fact that he had this station and ultimately desired to sell it. We came to a point of agreement, and ultimately the station was acquired and transferred through the FCC, and it's 100,000 watts. It's on one of the highest points in Upper Michigan with the tower, and it transmits to Upper Michigan, Houghton, Hancock, various other parts of Upper Michigan there with 100,000 watts. It was formerly known as WBUM, but we didn't feel that bum was a good way to describe Christian radio, so we changed it to VCN. That's WVCN, Voice for Christ to the Northlands.
And as we have seen through the years as well, ministering to stations across the country in locations from Corpus Christi to Englewood, Florida, to Chattanooga, Tennessee, Zanesville, Ohio, and other locations as well, Olney, Illinois. The VCY miracle here, God's continuing miracle, the VCY story has continued. Vic, here in conclusion, I know you must have some general overall thoughts too.
Well, this continuing miracle is something that it's almost like riding the tail of a tornado, because there will very soon be on the air. And of course, this recording was made on May the 9th, 2001. So if you hear this tape later, it has obviously happened. But there will be the completion of another station just outside of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. That's KVCF. And this station will be going on the air. It will minister to Sioux Falls as well as Yankton and other areas surrounding. And this tower is 800 feet above ground and will certainly be touching the lives of thousands of people. There will also be the operation and installation of a new station in Iron Mountain, Michigan, which will be serving the city of Iron Mountain and area as well.
Vic, just a closing thought or two about how you have seen God's consistent faithfulness over these past several decades.
Someone asked once, you must have a 10-year plan as far as the rate of development that has occurred. And Jim, I wish I could say that because it sounds more scholarly. It sounds more organized. But you've been with us over 15 years here, and you've seen how sometimes God has literally pushed us into a situation to meet a need which wasn't initially out there in our plan at all. But God has verified, like the situation in Toma and WVCX, one of our strongest stations today, that God opened a door and practically pushed us through it. And as we think of God's provision, it has been absolutely amazing. There is no person on this staff or board of directors that can claim any ability to see God work in the ways that he has. It has literally been running to keep up with the Lord as these doors open. And this is why we call it a continuing miracle, because practically everywhere we turn, you see the hand of God in other ways. There have been miracles happen this past week in providing things that is too long to even talk about here. The ministry of Trail Ridge Ranch and Conference Center and other things that are emerging as a part of VCY America. And someday we'll have more miracles to add to this tape.
Vic, we appreciate you sharing with us and sharing the heartbeat of what the Lord has done here through the years. Folks, you've been listening to God's Continuing Miracle, the VCY story. Psalm 127:1 says, "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it." For our over 40 years now, God has shown his faithfulness in more miraculous ways than what time allows for us to talk about today. He's provided for this ministry, reaching beyond radio to youth ministry, discipleship programs, camping ministry, outreach to delinquent youth, bookstore ministry, and on the list goes. The miracle continues and is evidenced every time a life is changed for Jesus Christ. To God be the glory, great things he hath done.